What up, improvement geeks? It's Alan, and the world has turned upside down in a matter of a few weeks. And what I'd like to talk to you about today is how you can use PDSA Cycles in order to help you achieve your crash implementation. As I said, the world is a very different place now. Because of COVID-19, we've had to implement a lot of changes very, very quickly. A lot of changes. And what we risk when we do that is sacrificing quality for timeliness, which is appropriate, but there is a way to do it correctly. And the model for improvement is one way that we can minimize the trade-off by ensuring that you are learning all along the way. So let's look at the model for improvement right here. So the first part is all about strategy. So it's about deciding what success looks like and coming up with a strategy of how to achieve it. The second part, which is where the PDSA cycles come in, is all about execution. This is where the rubber hits the road. And this is the part that we're going to focus on today because really the rubber has been hitting the road in a big way at our center. What is a PDSA cycle? Well, it's an acronym. It stands for Plan, Do, Study, Act. The plan phase consists of activities that contribute to your hypothesis about what will make a change. The do phase is where you actually execute your plan and overcome barriers. The study phase involves measuring the results of that execution, and the act phase involves deciding what to do, i.e. refine further, adopt, or drop. There are multiple types of PDSA cycles. You can have a testing cycle, an implementation cycle, or a spread cycle. Today we're going to focus on the testing and refinement cycle. It's easier to demonstrate than it is to describe it. So I will use a practical example, first from personal improvement and then from an actual project that was done in the nephrology division here at our center. I will offer two key points though. The first is that for individual cycles, prediction plus reflection is where the learning comes in. The key to this overall methodology, however, is to string several of these PDSA cycles together. And what you get if you do that is a gradual refinement of your intervention over time based on rapid, agile learning. So let's take a personal improvement example. Let's say you want to lose weight, say 20 pounds in 6 months. How would I set that up as a series of PDSA cycles? So the plan phase might involve deciding to do a cardio workout 4 times a week for 30 minutes. So you predict that what will happen is that at this intensity, you'll get a weight loss, say, of 4 pounds in 2 weeks. And so the do phase, joining a gym. Study phase, you went 4 times a week, but you really only did 10 minutes on the treadmill every time. And so you can't really assess the effectiveness of your intervention because you didn't actually properly implement it. And so based on that, the act phase, you would pick a different activity that would allow you to get to that 30-minute threshold. So in PDSA cycle number 2, perhaps you decide that you're going to pick scheduled classes instead of running on the treadmill as your intervention. So the plan phase for your second cycle involves predicting that going to scheduled classes 4 times a week will get you to that required 120 minutes per week of cardio. The do phase would involve signing up for 2 weeks worth of classes. In the study phase, let's say you went to 7 out of the 8 classes that you signed up for. You actually did 350 minutes of cardio. in 2 weeks, but your weight loss was only 2 pounds. So in this case, unlike the first PDSA cycle where you didn't even hit your process measure and so you couldn't really even assess the efficacy of your theory, in this PDSA cycle, you have hit your process measure. You have gone to the classes and yet still weren't hitting your outcome measure. So the act phase of this PDSA cycle would dictate something like looking at other drivers that might be contributing to the lack of success. And so you might look at your caloric intake, you might look at your stress levels, other factors beyond just cardiovascular activity. And so that illustrates, those two PDSA cycles illustrate how you can evolve your intervention with time and with experience. The thing is that you can have multiple PDSA cycles happening at the same time. So to take that example again, you could have a series of PDSA cycles happening on the activity side, and you could have a series of PDSA cycles on the caloric consumption side. And those two things could be happening in parallel so that you're getting maximum effect on your outcome measure, which in this case is weight loss. Let's do a clinical example now. So my colleague, Dr. Louise Moist, who is a nephrologist, she gave me this very good example of how the nephrology department really had to respond very quickly to the COVID threat. So the nephrology division at our center is responsible for 15 dialysis sites across the region. And so their challenge was to minimize the risk of transmission of COVID, yet still providing dialysis care across all of those centers. So if we were to use the model for improvement to frame their project, first we asked what were they trying to accomplish. So typically this would be in the form of a SMART goal, so specific, measurable, achievable, relevant, and time dependent. This project, however, was extremely time sensitive, and so there was no luxury for any sort of baseline data collection. They had to implement something new now in response to the impending threat. Qualitatively, project team was really just trying to minimize the number of patients who acquired a COVID infection via exposure during the dialysis visit. And they attempted to do this by minimizing the exposure of uninfected patients to high-risk COVID-positive dialysis patients or environments. So how do we know that a change is an improvement? Well, success here is not really defined in the traditional sense with a statistically significant increase on a run chart or a SPC chart. Really what they were looking to do was minimize the conversion of patients from negative to positive. And secondly, they were attempting to do that by minimizing the number of high-risk or positive patients being incorrectly cohorted into a low-risk patient environment or area. So what changes did they make that could result in improvement? Well, they thought of two main ones that they had to implement and refine very quickly. The first was a risk stratification tool that would divide patients into high-risk, intermediate, and low-risk categories. And the second was a corresponding redistribution of physical space in order to keep patients with their respective risk categories. So I'm going to focus on the second one, the physical space redesign, because I think that's where the most interesting learnings occurred. So the plan phase of PDSA Cycle 1 involved dividing the existing dialysis space into risk strata. They predicted that physical division of space would minimize the low-risk patient's probability of acquiring an infection. So the do phase involved drafting a redesign on paper and drafting a procedure to minimize the risk of high-risk patients getting access to low-risk areas. And they needed to obtain consensus. In the study phase, the draft did obtain consensus, and so the act phase would have been to proceed with a dry run, test the procedure. In cycle 2, the second planning phase was simulating a dialysis unit with test patients and sending them through the test procedure. They predicted that the simulated process would minimize the risk of high-risk patients in low-risk areas. In the do phase, they executed the simulation with fake patients. And in the study phase, they found that in several instances, high-risk patients were walking through low-risk areas risking contamination. So they had to readjust the physical processes and the pathways in order to make sure that high-risk or positive patients weren't going through low-risk areas. And the ACT phase was to retest with the revised process. In the third PDSA cycle, they retested the procedure, and they predicted that the new process would address the shortcomings of the first test. The do phase was another execution similar to the first one. In the study phase, they indeed found that the contact of high-risk patients in low-risk areas was minimized. So the ACT phase was an execution and implementation of the new processes at scale on live patients. So in the fourth PDSA cycle, the plan was to implement the procedure on live patients. The prediction was that there would be no high-risk patients cohorted into low-risk areas. In the do phase, they educated the staff and adopted the procedure. In the study phase, the daily huddle that was done with all the dialysis centers around our region indicated that patients who are febrile were actually making it to the low-risk area. They weren't being captured. And so in the ACT phase, they had to revise the process to include a temperature screening right up front. So that's a good example how even in the scenario where you needed to implement something yesterday in almost a crash fashion, there is still the opportunity to be reflective and take away learnings so that at least your implementation is as optimal as it can be given the circumstances. And the PDSA framework is an optimal way to do that. There are other major benefits aside from just being able to rapidly adjust and refine. So doing PDSA cycles formally really formalizes the decision-making process and ensures that, or helps ensure that the proposed changes are being done based on best available data at the time. And secondly, if you're thinking of sharing your learnings either through presentation or a publication, then this really does provide a clear rationale for your chosen interventions and why the refinements happened in the order that they did. There are several pitfalls, though, that you can observe when using this framework. The first is actually omitting the planning phase altogether, and this happens more commonly than you would think. Often the diagnostic phase is completely skipped, and teams will go right from problem to solution without doing the proper diagnostic phase on which to base their interventions. The second is poor planning for data collection during the planning phase. So unless you are collecting the proper data, you cannot really execute the study phase properly. And so you will be basing your ACT phase on either incomplete or inaccurate information. The third pitfall is something that's referred to as fake PDSA cycles. And so for the details, I'll refer you to an excellent article on PDSA cycles written by my colleague and former classmate, Dr. Jerome Leese from Toronto. And in a nutshell, The spirit of the PDSA methodology is really one of rapid iteration and learning based on sequential testing. And fake PDSA is really PDSA in name only. So features of a project that has done fake PDSA is only doing one PDSA cycle, or having an intervention which in its final form looks very similar to what the proposed initial form was, reflecting very little adjustment or iteration along the way. So these are not in the spirit of true Plan, Do, Study, Act methodology. So I promised you guys a tool, and the Institute for Healthcare Improvement does have a PDSA worksheet that I try to use for all of my quality improvement projects. I will provide a link in the description below. And really what this does is it forces me to really think about and plan out the cycle ahead of time. It makes me think about what I'm predicting will happen. It makes me think about what are the things that I need to collect in order to do a proper study phase. And so I recommend filling this out for each PDSA cycle. And afterwards, I have a nice log of my thinking throughout the project so that I can go back and reconstruct the rationale at various points along the way. So to wrap up, take-home points: prediction plus reflection equals learning, and rapid iteration equals gradual refinement as opposed to a one and done. So I hope you have found this video useful. If so, please consider hitting the like button or subscribing down below, and I'll see you in the next video. Peace.